Okay, I'm going to resume here. This is part 2, second half of the discussion today, lecture. And switch over to the screen again. There's some terminology with regard to the operating system. When we talk about configuring an operating system, right? Most operating systems have, oh boy, I messed that up, didn't I? Whoops. Again. Speaking of configuring an operating system, that's one of the features of an operating system. It has to have the ability to make changes to the way it behaves. And it might have to do with the different hardware that the operating system is communicating with and the different programs. So those are all things that you can change. Of course, in an operating system, you can install new software and new hardware. It can also change the resources of the computer, like memory, video displays, things of that sort. Those are things, if you change those, that's called a configuration. And almost any operating system has some kind of facility to make that reasonably easy to do. Not necessarily always easy, but you know, it's going to be some configuration. Generally, it's when you install new operating system programs or any new hardware in Windows, pretty much automatically in some way, and give you the opportunity to make a configuration, but not always. Sometimes you'll put in a piece of hardware, a new piece of equipment on your computer, recognize it at all, and other times it might notice it's something there, but it doesn't know what to do with it. And it'll let you know about that in that case. Windows tries as much as possible to automatically adapt itself to new hardware, and that's called plug and play. And it was not always a feature of the operating systems that would recognize new hardware. Apple does the same. Apple iOS does that, and so does Linux. They all try to recognize new hardware, but sometimes it doesn't. And so it needs a little help, and that's where you need to install additional software, such as drivers. A new piece of hardware, you hook it up to your computer, it doesn't know what to do with it. That's where we have to install a driver, and we're pretty much familiar with that. Something that's fairly common, and say, for example, printers. Printers often need a driver so that Windows knows how to use it. Because BIOS, the basic input-output system, is only for the basic stuff, not for maybe the more advanced things. It doesn't necessarily know what to do with some of that other hardware. So a while ago, I mentioned the disk the way of communicating directly to the kernel. In the early days of operating systems for the IBM PC family of operating systems, they called it the disk operating system because it was a kernel and a file system, and there wasn't a graphical user interface. You had to type in commands. So they called that the disk operating system. But we still have a lot of the things that the disk operating system had, features that it Windows. So people would often refer to that as the DOS. It's still there. It's still available to us. This is the command line, the part of the operating system that you communicate using commands that you type on the keyboard. DOS was never designed to multitask. So if you actually ran a early version of what later became Windows, it could only run one program at a time. Today, we can run multiple versions, multiple programs written for the disk operating system, or we can run multiple programs and have several different versions of the same or different programs running simultaneously. So multitasking is a feature of Windows, but it wasn't a feature of the original disk operating system. But at least we can still communicate with the kernel using it, and we still can give it commands of different types to communicate with it. These are called DOS, referred to as DOS commands. They're internal commands that you can issue to the operating system to perform different tasks. I already mentioned some of those, like copy and move and delete, and there are many others. Originally, the operating system kernel had a program called command. And you can still think of it as still being there, although it's not called that anymore. But there is a program running inside the operating system that you can talk to using keyboard commands and issue these types of commands. And those commands that the command.com program would recognize are called internal commands. They are commands that it knew how to run itself. It would do these commands directly, or it knew how to get those commands to run. Then there are other commands that when you type them into the keyboard in the DOS prompt or the command prompt, those commands it doesn't know how to do. But what it knows how to do is run programs that have the name of that command. So sometimes when you type in a command, what it will do is it will run another program to get that command to do something. Or really what you're doing is running a program. It's not that you're talking directly to the operating system at that point. The operating system is simply running another program. So here's an example of some of the commands that the command.com, the kernel, would understand directly. This is just a small sample, but these are simple commands like setting the date, for example, or the directory dir is a really common command. That gives you a list of all the files and also the directories, or what we would call folders, and folders within folders, which they called subdirectories in those days. Sometimes we still use that terminology. Really, a directory and a folder are pretty much the same thing. And deleting a command, or copying a command, or renaming a file, copying a file, or renaming a file. So those are just examples of commands that command.com, the kernel itself, would understand, and there are many others. And then there's commands that it doesn't understand, but what they are is really programs. So you type a command in to run a program. So like say you type check disk. Check disk would be a program that would check a disk drive to see if it's functioning properly, to make sure that its data is intact. Or maybe edit, which runs an editor, a little program kind of like a word processor. Or format, to prepare a disk to store data. We still do that a lot when we get a new hard drive or something, we format it. Or maybe print. There's a command to print something. That's a command that is not really part of the operating system kernel, but rather it's a separate program that gets run when you type in that command. Those are called external commands.
Also the chkdsk, we're still using it for mainly when we try to repair one computer.
Yeah. It's still a useful command to check to see that
the hard disk drive,
that the hard drives are working correctly. Now, the original disk operating system was called the disk operating system because one of its main features its functions was to provide a file system and a way of organizing files. So what it would do is it had a standard way of naming files. And we still see a lot of this around today, although it's not limited as it was in those days. Originally, it was limited to up to 8 letters or numbers, 8 characters for the name, and then a 3-letter extension defined the type of file it was. So, like, for example, auto exec, that has 8 letters, automatic executes, what that was short for. And then bat. A bat was a batch file. A batch file is a kind of program that you can run or you can create. Or config.sys. Config is the name of the file, and sys means that it's a system file. Or myfile.txt. Text is a type of file. A text file is a file that is usually from an editor, a simple word processor. And these are called extensions, and there are many different file name extensions. You can create your own if you want to. There's some standard ones, but there are many others. So, for example, a file name with .bmp, that's a kind of graphics file, an image file. Or .com, that's a type of command file, which is actually a program. Or .dll, that is a part of a larger program. A dynamic link library is a program that's divided up into many parts because it's too large to, or maybe unwieldy to load it all as one program. It's loaded as several, and they call those dynamic link libraries, meaning that you have different things you can use on different features of a program that you can borrow from other programs, in effect. Programmers create dynamic link libraries for big programs. Or .doc is a document file from a word processor. Or .exe, that's an executable, that's a program, an executable file that will run directly when you run it. .ini, that would be an initialization file of some kind. Or a log file, .log or .text, I mentioned that before, a text file. Those are all examples, and there are many more that are out there for different things. Like you might see a picture have .jpg after JPEG, or .mp3, that would be a music file. Or you can think of many examples for that. Now, file names could have lots of different characters, not just alphabet characters and letters and numbers, but also some of the punctuation characters. But there were some characters that were reserved and would not be part of a name because they would be used by the operating system for special purposes. So here's a list of some characters you cannot use for a name, and that's still true today. You generally wouldn't use some of these special characters for your names, but you can use all the alphabet, all the letters and numbers. You are no longer, though, limited to just 8 characters in Windows. You can use much longer names. You can have really long names if you want to. So, but we still use the extensions a lot. The 3-letter extensions are still very common to this day. In fact, not only are they used by Windows, but you see a lot of those 3-letter extensions used by Apple, iOS, and you see it used in Linux too. So they become kind of ubiquitous. They have been used for a long time by a number of different operating systems. Now, an operating system has to be loaded into your computer. When you turn your computer on, there's a program built in called BIOS, Basic Input-Output System. It gets loaded immediately because it's already built into the motherboard. It's stored in what's called a read-only memory. It's a read-only memory because you normally only read it, you don't write to it, well, although there are some read-only memories that you can reprogram. And that's when you do that, you maybe even change your BIOS with special software that can do this. But normally you don't change BIOS. BIOS is fixed in there and it's there already. Now the operating system isn't like that. The operating system has to be loaded. And that process is called booting. And that's the operating system is brought in from the file storage system. That's where it is. It's actually a series of different programs that get loaded up. There's a special key combination that you can type to get the attention of the computer. And this was originally on the original IBM PC. It was Control-Alt-Delete. And it's still there today. It doesn't do what it used to do. Originally, when you type in this special command, it would cause the computer to reboot. Now, when you type Control-Delete, it gets the attention of the operating system. It's sort of like, hey, wake up, I need your special attention. So if you type Control-Delete, it will respond to that by giving you a menu. The other way of restarting, of course, restarting a computer is by turning it on and off. And that's called a cold boot. And that would be, by the way, when you hit Control-Delete, there is the option then of doing a shutdown or restart. And also you can do cold boot, which would be where you do a complete shutdown and then power it off, turn off the computer, and then turn it back on again. In the operating system, you'll find some files that are special for the operating system. An example of that would be a configuration file. It's a list of that the operating system needs. This is just one example of a common name for a configuration file. This one actually is a legacy one, meaning it's an old file name that's been around a long time. But you'll still see it in Windows. It's still there. But there's a lot of different configuration files like this. They're files that Windows itself uses to configure itself. And inside of these files, there will be that you can configure things. At least nowadays, there's a thing called the registry of settings for the operating system. It's a different, more organized way about the operating system and the way it's configured. And as a computer technician, you will sometimes encounter the registry and have to interact with it in different ways. Now, the other way to communicate with the operating system is through the graphical user interface, which is what we're more familiar with. And there were different versions of Windows. The original first Windows to have a graphical user interface was called Windows 3. There was a Windows 1 and 2, but they were sort of like an experiment. And then Windows 3 was actually loaded on top. You'd have DOS, you'd have the disk operating system, which was the graphical, which didn't have a graphical user interface. And then you would run a program called Windows, and it would run this Windows 3. So it was more or less just taking the place of typing commands directly. It was fairly primitive. And then came along an operating system called Windows 95, which didn't need DOS anymore. It included DOS. It came with it. You didn't have to load it separate anymore. You just run Windows, start up Windows, and it would take off. It was also the first 32-bit operating system, meaning that it used 32 bits for addressing information rather than 16 like Windows 3 did. So it could use a large amount of memory, up to 4 gigabytes of memory, which in those days was way more than any computer. Not uncommon for a computer to have more than that, but in those days. Then the next, and that added some new things, like it added the ability to have an optical drive where you could have you can play movies, and it had a web browser. That was about the time when the internet started becoming popular. Back in about the late 1990s. That's kind of, for me, doesn't sound that long ago, really, you know, 1998, it's 2016, so that was 18 years ago, but that really was kind of the beginning of the internet. It was the 90s, right? In the middle, beginning of the 90s was when it just started up. I had a job working where we used the internet in its early form. It didn't even have a browser. It was all mostly email. You typed commands and it was email. You could get pictures, but you had to load them with a special program called file transfer.
FTP.
And but there was no browser. You know, you didn't have a mouse and all that stuff. So it was fairly primitive. Mostly, it was just text stuff. But that's about the time when Windows took off. Windows was taking off, and they started to incorporate that in there. So here's a picture of what Windows 3 looks like. And see, it's pretty simple looking, and you had a mouse, and you could open and close files, things like that. Networks, and it didn't know anything about the internet, that's for sure. Well, although I guess you could get networking running on it later on. Windows 95 looks more like today's Windows, more or less. Had a menu, and you'd be fairly familiar with. You might not know how to operate that unless you had been familiar with it. But Windows 90 used today, we're familiar with, especially the start button. The idea of the start button. In fact, people got so used to the start button that when they came out with Windows 8, they tried to get rid of the start button because they thought, oh, we have a better idea. We want to make it like so it can run on tablets. People got mad. Oh, where's the start button? I want my start button back. And so, yeah.
I mean, I say, why not take the mouse cursor all the way down to down left, and then there should be like a hidden trigger. If you trigger it, the whole screen gets now shows the start menu.
Yeah, but they put it back, didn't they? I mean, when they came out with Windows, 8.1, they put a button back, and Windows 10 still has like a button. So that was a very popular feature. And then there was Windows 98. Next version of Windows 95 looked a lot like Windows 95, but it had a lot of improvements, and it had started to incorporate the internet and multimedia, which means video, things like that. And then you mentioned Windows NT, right? NT, yeah. The new technology. That came around year 2000. Well, it came in the late 90s, but it started to come out in the late 90s. NT was a professional operating system. It wasn't for home stuff, but it was mostly for business stuff. It wouldn't run games. It was not very friendly for home computers. At that time, around the year 2000, they also had Windows ME, which was the Millennium Edition,
yep.
Which was Windows 98 with some added stuff. It was kind of a buggy version of Windows. It had a lot of reputation for being rather buggy.
Yeah.
But that was what these look like. This is what Windows NT looked like. Windows NT looked originally like Windows 3. It was kind of primitive looking and ran a lot like Windows 3. And then Windows NT looked a lot like Windows 95. But it wouldn't run games and stuff. It was more, like I said, for business stuff. It looked a little bit like Windows 98, but a little bit fancier in its graphics and so forth. So those were all this was sort of the Windows ME for the home computer was sort of a stopgap between what came later. And Windows NT really did have some new stuff in it, but it wouldn't run a lot of the programs for home computer.
No, actually, the main difference was the NT was mostly for communications and support, unstable support, because like what for servers, they have more capable for handling communication, files, storage, writes, and stuff like that.
It was
actually when you get the NT and you try to connect also speakers, they don't have the driver for speakers. They don't have driver for the high definition monitors. That's why it looks like very, very rudimentary. All the features, all the fancy features was for the home versions.
You
like
could add.
we suffer a lot with we try to connect also an additional monitor to the NT because they don't have the drivers for that.
You mentioned that Windows NT was used a lot for servers and
Yes.
for the early servers for networks.
Network. That's what.
Yeah, that's when networking was starting to becoming very popular in offices.
Exactly.
People were starting to connect computers together inside of offices and buildings and things to communicate with each other to be able to file. And they needed computers to act as servers. So that was one of the jobs of Windows NT. And then they came out with a more advanced version of Windows NT, which was more friendly, and that was called Windows 2000. And then kind of a home version of Windows 2000 was called Windows XP. So they still had these two different branches. They had more of the home version, and they had the more professional version, which they called Windows 2000. And then today we have they combined these two, and we have started with Windows Vista and Windows 7 and Windows 8 and now Windows 10. And they are all based on this NT. So these are the NT family of operating systems, starting with Windows 2000 and Windows XP and Windows Vista, and then Windows 7 and Windows 8. Windows 8 was a very radical departure. They started using these blocks, and they got away from the start button, but it was still, still the same Windows underneath, more or less. And then they kind of went back to the style of the original Windows when they went to Windows 10. It's blocky blocks, but it also has a start button. We're fairly familiar with that. Windows 10 is also designed for touchscreens more than the other operating systems to do the navigation there.
Microsoft tried to get with the iPad, with the iPod, but he tried to do the same with the Xbox, and he bring the interface, the Xbox to the PC, and it doesn't work completely.
Yeah. So that they tried to make them all be compatible with each other, didn't they? Yeah. So that was it. So that is, those are the different versions of the operating system. One of the, and then I could, there of course many other operating systems that we could talk about, and sometimes we'll learn about, they have a lot of these same features in common. So, for example, Linux, which is also a very popular operating system in the world, and it is a derivative of an operating system that's been around a long time called Unix. And by the way, Linux was started by a man named Linus. Linus, he lived in Finland, and he took Unix and put it on the PC. At that time, the only operating system that was available was DOS and Windows, right? Windows was available, Windows 3 and so forth. And so he thought, well, hey, maybe we can make this Unix work, because Unix actually was a very powerful operating system that had been around a long time. And he created his own version of Unix that ran on the PC. Because in those days, Unix was designed for big computers that were mainframes and mini computers, machines that most people couldn't afford. They were very powerful computers for in those days, but they cost tens of thousands of dollars or more. He thought, well, I can take the operating system from those expensive computers and put it on the PC and make it run, and that's what he did. So that's where Unix came from, and they call it Linux because it's Linus Torvalds was his name. Linus's Unix. And what's Linux is, though, is a totally different operating system than Windows, even though it looks a lot like it, and it can run some of the same programs, but they have to be they have to be customized to run in Linux, you see. So if you write a program for Windows, you won't necessarily be able to run on Linux. And if you write a program for Linux, it won't necessarily run on Windows, right? You have there's a lot of differences there. So it's like a different world. You can almost think of Linux as a different family of computers, even though it uses the same hardware. And so you might be running Linux right now. If you have a cell phone which has an operating system called Android on it, it's actually Linux inside. It's the Linux kernel, it's the core of Linux, but what's a little bit different about Linux than Windows is that you can configure the way it looks, and you can put many different graphical user interfaces on it. It's got a kernel, just like Windows does, but it has many different graphical user interfaces, and there are very many different versions of how that works. And Android is just one of those. There's many others. In fact, if you go to your, if you're interested in that, just Linux, there's just more about Linux, because we're primarily focusing on Windows in this class, but we will talk about Linux sometimes too, because it is much out there. There's of course a website for it, as you can expect. But what I wanted to show you was, and that, by the way, that guy Linus Torvalds, he's still in charge of it. He's still the kind of the boss of Linux, meaning there are thousands of people that contribute to it all over the world, but he coordinates them. He's kind of the boss of the coordination. He's not as rich a man as Bill Gates, by any means. I suppose he's a millionaire, but he's no billionaire. Because Linux has always been pretty much free. So if you
open source.
You didn't have to buy it. It's called open source, yeah. I'm just going to show you something here. It's kind of fun. If you go to this website, Distro Watch, you can look at the list of the many versions of Linux that are out there. It lists like 100 of them, and there's many more than that. And they all are Linux, but they look different when you run them. I mean, they have different graphical user interfaces. They have, they might have start buttons of different kinds, or different kinds of menuing systems that vary from one to another. These computers in here have Linux loaded on them also. They have Windows and they have Linux too. They have a version called Ubuntu, which is a very popular, that they call distribution of Linux, or version of Linux. That's what it looks like. You can run that then. So that's another operating system, kind of like Windows, that's out there that runs on the same kind of hardware. Probably you'll actually be surprised at how many computers actually do run Linux that you don't even know about, like your cell phone if they run Android. Apple's operating system is actually based on a version of Unix too. A different, not Linux. It doesn't have Linux in it. It has a thing called BSD Unix, which came from Berkeley University, UC Berkeley, and they adapted it quite a few years ago. Apple took that version of Unix and started adapting it. So a lot of the commands that Linux uses, the Apple operating systems use, because they share this common ancestry with Unix. Well, that's pretty much a little overview of the operating system. We'll continue to learn a lot about more things about the operating system as we go along, and especially in our test out, we'll be using, learning about features of the operating system and how to configure it to do different things. We will learn about the kernel of the operating system, the commands that you can issue. There's some of those commands I was talking about, the DOS commands, you'll find very useful as for troubleshooting and configuration. So as we go through test out. So this week again we're doing let's see, we're on the wrong one here. Operating system. So we're up to now operating system section 1.4 on test out. I put another slideshow here about the history of Windows. You might look at that. I kind of went over time there, but it looks at the different versions. I did a little bit of that in the presentation I was making there as well. And the story of the first personal computer is a video. A lot of great YouTube videos I could pick out there. It's kind of interesting, the history of where all this stuff came from. And that story, by the way, if you watch that video, really explains where Windows came from. It helps to understand where Windows came from because that first early personal computer was what got Bill Gates started, and is why Microsoft came about. So he actually got started way before the IBM PC, and that's one of the reasons why it's been grown to become the de facto standard. A lot of times standards for computers evolve because somebody is first. So you're the first guy to make the operating system for something. Maybe somebody else could have come up with that operating system, but they didn't. So that's how Microsoft came about, and they developed from there. They've done a good job. I mean, I think Microsoft is, but they had their times when they had lots of problems and bugs and things over the years. And I guess nowadays, probably Microsoft's biggest competitor would be Linux, which is kind of an interesting competitor because Linux isn't a company, nobody owns it. So, but there's a lot of computers that use it. It's like an alternative to Windows and to Microsoft. And then the other big competitor would be Apple, of course. Apple's a whole other story. They have their own operating systems and everything. So that's a little interesting thing about the history of it there. All right. I'm going to close off our broadcast here. So thank you for listening, whatever, and participating. Be sure you send me any questions you might have, or if you're having any difficulties. Let's do a test out. Also, oh, by the way, on test out, you can get tech support. Right? If you go to the test out website, these would be technical problems with test out itself. If you call this number here, they're really good about helping you with using the simulator and so forth. So if you're having just difficulties with the interface or something you don't understand, it's pretty simple to use, but you might have some difficulties, then you can contact them for that. All right, I'm going to say goodbye. Stop the broadcast there. Okay.